They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when a young African leader decides to write his own? Today, we bring you the untold story of how President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood his ground against one of the most powerful figures in the world, French President Emmanuel Macron. This isn't just a story of politics. It's about dignity, courage, and the unstoppable rise of a new Africa. Stay with us because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about African leadership and global power dynamics. Did you know that a single phone call from a humble African president made a global superpower back down? That's right, and bold conversation changed the course of history and ignited a fire of hope across the entire African continent. But this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about standing up for centuries of pride, independence, and the unshakable belief that Africa would no longer bow to the pressure of foreign influence. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to tell us, where are you watching from? Drop the name of your country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Also, how long have you been watching content like this? Are you new here, or have you been following stories of African pride and resilience for a while? Let us know. If this kind of empowering and eye-opening content speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story like this. We're building a global community of thinkers, dreamers, and believers who know that history is still being written and you're a part of it. Now, get comfortable and stay tuned, because in the next few minutes, you'll learn how a young leader turned a moment of disrespect into a historic stand for freedom and dignity. Ready? Let's begin. In the heart of West Africa lies a country often overlooked by the world, a nation that for decades struggled under the weight of poverty, political instability, and the shadow of foreign control, Burkina Faso. Its name, meaning land of upright people, carried a deep sense of pride, but for far too long, that pride had been buried beneath corruption and external influence. The people had endured years of broken promises, empty speeches, and leaders who seemed more interested in serving their foreign benefactors than their own citizens. But change, as it often does, came when it was least expected. From the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the quiet rural villages, whispers began to spread about a young man named Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't born into power. His family wasn't wealthy, nor did he have political connections. What he did have was something far more powerful, a relentless love for his country and a burning desire to restore its dignity. While many young men his age sought opportunities abroad, Ibrahim stayed, believing that true change could only come from within. His passion inspired those around him, and his refusal to bow to corruption set him apart in a nation desperate for honest leadership. Ibrahim's journey wasn't easy. He faced opposition from entrenched elites who viewed his ideals as dangerous and naive. He was labeled a dreamer, someone too young to understand the complexities of power. But Ibrahim wasn't swayed. He traveled across the country, speaking directly to the people, listening to their struggles, and promising one simple thing: to lead with integrity and put the needs of his people first. This message resonated deeply. In village after village, city after city, crowds gathered to hear his words, to witness a man who spoke not with the polished language of a politician, but with the heartfelt honesty of a son of the soil. When the opportunity finally came for him to step into leadership, the nation was at a crossroads. Years of mismanagement had left the economy fragile, basic infrastructure in ruins, and the spirit of the people broken. Foreign companies controlled vast resources, and even the most essential services like electricity and education were failing. Yet in the midst of this despair, Ibrahim stood tall. His vision for a new Burkina Faso wasn't based on empty slogans, but on actionable plans. He called for reforms that targeted corruption directly, dismantled exploitative economic agreements, and prioritized local development over foreign dependency. It wasn't long before signs of change began to appear. Under Ibrahim's leadership, the lights started to flicker back on in homes that had been dark for years. Schools, once abandoned and falling apart, were reopened and properly funded. Roads were repaired, creating new opportunities for trade and connection between distant regions. Perhaps most importantly, corrupt officials who had for years stolen from the public treasury were brought to justice. For the first time in decades, the people saw their government not as an enemy, but as an ally. Hope began to take root. Families who had long given up on the idea of a better future found themselves dreaming again. Children walked to school with backpacks filled with new books, communities gathered to build clinics and clean water systems, and small businesses flourished under new economic policies that favored local entrepreneurs. Ibrahim wasn't just repairing infrastructure, he was rebuilding the nation's spirit. Despite these successes, Ibrahim knew that his greatest challenge wasn't internal but external. For centuries, Burkina Faso and many African nations had been subjected to the will of foreign powers. Colonialism had officially ended, but its lingering influence remained through economic control and political pressure. France, in particular, held significant sway over the country's resources and policies. Ibrahim understood that true independence could only be achieved if his nation freed itself from these invisible chains. And so, with the same courage he had shown when facing his own political battles, he prepared to confront the global forces that had long kept his people in poverty. It was a bold and dangerous path, but for Ibrahim, the fight for dignity and freedom was worth any risk. Little did he know that this fight would soon bring him face to face with one of the most powerful leaders in the world and would ignite a moment in history that the people of Burkina Faso would never forget. When Ibrahim Traoré officially assumed office, the mood across Burkina Faso was a complex mix of hope and skepticism. For generations, people had heard promises of reform, only to watch their leaders fall into the same corrupt patterns. But Ibrahim was different, and he knew that mere words would no longer be enough. He needed to act swiftly and decisively to prove that this time, things were truly changing. His first priority was addressing the country's most pressing issues: electricity and education. In a land where darkness had become a nightly reality, bringing light to people's homes was more than an infrastructure project. It was a symbol of renewed hope. Under his leadership, aging power grids were repaired, and new energy initiatives were introduced to ensure even remote villages received electricity. Slowly, night after night, homes that had known only candlelight began to glow with electric bulbs. But it wasn't just about turning on the lights. Ibrahim understood that for a nation to truly rise, its people needed knowledge and opportunity. He launched a sweeping education reform, reopening long-abandoned schools and building new ones in underserved areas. Teachers were offered better wages, and new curriculums focused not just on academic knowledge, but also on instilling a sense of national pride and self-reliance. Ibrahim believed that a child who understood their country's value would grow up to defend it with conviction. Economic reform came next. For years, Burkina Faso's wealth had flowed out of the country through unfair trade agreements and foreign-controlled industries. Ibrahim initiated policies that favored local businesses and small entrepreneurs. Foreign companies were forced to renegotiate contracts under fairer terms, and revenue from natural resources was redirected to fund local development projects. Suddenly, small businesses that had struggled for survival began to flourish. Markets were filled with local goods, and people started to believe that prosperity was no longer a distant dream, but something achievable within their lifetime. Perhaps the most daring of Ibrahim's reforms was his relentless battle against corruption. He created a special anti-corruption task force that reported directly to his office, bypassing traditional bureaucratic channels often plagued by bribery and inefficiency. High-profile investigations were launched against officials previously considered untouchable. It wasn't long before the first major arrests were made. Public figures who had once walked proudly through the streets now faced the consequences of their greed in courtrooms. This sent a powerful message. No one was above the law. With each passing day, Ibrahim's leadership began to transform the national psyche. Hope, once a fragile and rare emotion, became a steady undercurrent in everyday life. Citizens volunteered to help rebuild their communities. Young people organized initiatives to improve their neighborhoods, planting trees, repairing community centers, and offering free tutoring for children. A sense of shared responsibility emerged, as if the entire nation had awakened from a long, bitter slumber. Yet, amidst this wave of positive change, Ibrahim remained fully aware of the looming external pressures. He knew that while the hearts of his people were changing, powerful forces abroad were growing uneasy. Burkina Faso's increasing independence threatened long-standing geopolitical interests, particularly those of France, which had historically maintained economic and political influence over its former colonies. As Ibrahim sat in his modest presidential office, overlooking the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, he often pondered the road ahead. His country was rising, but would the world allow it to succeed on its own terms? This question would soon be answered in a dramatic confrontation that would capture the attention of the entire world. Despite the positive transformation unfolding within Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré was fully aware that the winds of change often stir storms from beyond. While his people began to rebuild their faith in leadership and community, foreign powers grew increasingly unsettled by his unapologetic stance on sovereignty. Chief among them was France, a former colonial ruler that had, for decades, maintained a tight grip on the economic and political affairs of its former colonies through subtle yet powerful, means-unfavorable trade agreements, foreign aid strings, and deep-rooted diplomatic influence. Macron's administration had kept a close eye on Ibrahim's reforms. Every policy that pulled Burkina Faso further from French economic dependency was viewed as a direct challenge to France's long-standing interests in the region. Diplomatic channels became tense. French ambassadors delivered carefully worded messages of concern, masked as advice but veiled threats were always hidden beneath. Despite this, Ibrahim remained resolute. He had no intention of allowing his country to remain a pawn in the global chessboard of power politics. Then came the unexpected announcement. President Emmanuel Macron planned to visit Burkina Faso. It was framed publicly as a goodwill mission to strengthen ties and support the country's development. But within the halls of power in Ouagadougou, the mood was cautious. For the people, Macron's proposed visit resurrected painful memories. His previous trips to Africa had been marred by condescending remarks, none more infamous than his dismissive statement. "If the people of Burkina Faso do not have electricity, I am not responsible." Those words echoed in the hearts of many, seen as the embodiment of the West's indifference to Africa's struggles. Ibrahim knew this visit was not a simple diplomatic courtesy. It was a calculated move, an attempt to reassert France's influence in a country slipping beyond its control. The question wasn't just whether to accept the visit, but whether doing so would dishonor the sacrifices his people had made in pursuit of true independence. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the visit might bring much-needed investment and stability. Others argued that welcoming Macron without a formal apology for his past comments would undermine the very dignity that Ibrahim had fought to restore. In the end, Ibrahim decided that silence would be the greatest betrayal. He picked up the phone and requested a direct conversation with President Macron. Refusing to go through intermediaries, he believed that if respect was to be demanded, it had to be done face-to-face, or in this case, voice-to-voice. When Macron answered, Ibrahim wasted no time with diplomatic pleasantries. His tone was calm but firm. He reminded Macron of his past words and the wound they left on a nation struggling to rebuild its identity. For years, my people lived in darkness, not just without electricity, but without hope, Ibrahim said. We are changing that now. But if you wish to visit my country, it cannot be as a superior, addressing the inferior. You must come as an equal, with respect for our people's dignity. The conversation lasted an hour. Macron tried to explain himself, suggesting his words had been misunderstood, but Ibrahim did not waver. He made it clear that unless Macron publicly acknowledged the harm his words had caused and demonstrated genuine respect, the visit would not be welcome. Macron, perhaps unused to such direct defiance from an African leader, eventually conceded. The trip was quietly cancelled. The news spread like wildfire across Burkina Faso. In the streets of Ouagadougou, people gathered to celebrate not with fireworks or parades, but with heartfelt chants of victory. They didn't need grand displays. The simple fact that their leader had stood up to a global power was triumph enough. Across radio waves and social media, Ibrahim's words became a rallying cry. We no longer bow our heads, we stand tall. But the story didn't end there. In neighboring Ivory Coast, a very different response was taking shape. President Alassane Ouattara, long criticized for his close ties to the West, extended an immediate invitation to Macron. You are always welcome here, he reportedly told the French president. To many Africans, this was a betrayal. While Ibrahim had stood firm in defense of African dignity, Ouattara's open arms seemed to confirm the worst fears that some leaders were still willing to sacrifice their people's pride for political convenience. The people of Burkina Faso felt this betrayal deeply. Ouattara's actions weren't just seen as a political maneuver but as a symbolic surrender. Social media platforms erupted with anger. Citizens across Africa debated fiercely, contrasting the bravery of one leader against the perceived weakness of another. Hashtags praising Ibrahim flooded the internet, while Ouattara's name became a synonym for capitulation. Ibrahim, however, remained focused on his mission. He knew that his confrontation with Macron was just the beginning of a much larger struggle. True freedom required not only defiance against external control, but also unity among African nations. As tensions between Burkina Faso and foreign powers grew, so too did the realization that the fight for African dignity had only just begun. In the days following the cancelled visit, a new atmosphere settled over Burkina Faso. There was pride in the air, but also a deep sense of anticipation. The people had witnessed their president stand up to one of the most powerful leaders in the world. Now, they wondered what the next move would be. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this was not a time to celebrate. It was a time to strategize. He knew that defying a global power like France would come with consequences. Economic retaliation, political isolation, and even covert attempts to destabilize his government were all very real possibilities. Yet Ibrahim remained calm. He believed that true leadership wasn't about avoiding hardship but facing it head-on. Sitting in his office, surrounded by advisors, he laid out a bold plan. Instead of waiting for the inevitable backlash, he decided to take the offensive. He began reaching out to other African leaders, encouraging them to embrace a vision of a united, self-reliant continent. His message was clear. Africa could no longer afford to be divided and manipulated by foreign interests. Some leaders responded with cautious optimism, while others dismissed his ideas as idealistic and unrealistic. But Ibrahim understood that even the greatest revolutions started with small steps. He held a press conference, speaking directly to the people of Africa. His speech echoed across the continent. Our dignity is not negotiable. Our freedom is not for sale. If we stand together, no force on earth can break us. This speech sparked conversations in homes, marketplaces, and universities across Africa. Young people in particular felt a surge of pride. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting African unity and praising Ibrahim's courage. While Western media tried to downplay the significance of his stand, the African people knew that something historic was unfolding before their eyes. But even as his message spread, the economic pressure on Burkina Faso intensified. Foreign investors pulled out of projects, aid programs were suspended, and trade restrictions began to bite. The price of basic goods rose sharply, and whispers of discontent started to surface. Ibrahim's advisors urged him to make concessions, to open dialogue with France and the West to ease the burden, but he refused. Instead, Ibrahim turned inward. He launched national programs to boost local production of food and essential goods, reducing dependence on imports. Farmers received direct support, small factories were established to produce everyday necessities, and trade agreements were signed with neighboring countries willing to stand with Burkina Faso. Slowly but surely, the economy began to stabilize, and people adjusted to the new reality. One evening, as Ibrahim walked through the crowded streets of Ouagadougou, people stopped to greet him with genuine warmth and admiration. Despite the hardships, they knew their suffering was part of a greater struggle for independence. They didn't want pity or handouts. They wanted respect and the right to shape their own future. Ibrahim realized then that his fight was no longer just political, it had become spiritual. It was about restoring belief, not just in a government, but in the very idea that Africa could stand tall without external crutches. And so, in the privacy of his office, he made another decision that would define his legacy: to call for a historic summit of African nations, a gathering dedicated to charting a new course for the continent, free from the shadows of its colonial past. In the months following his bold stand against Macron, President Ibrahim Traoré worked tirelessly behind the scenes to turn his vision of a united Africa into reality. He sent personal letters and envoys to neighboring nations, appealing not just to political leaders, but to the hearts of their people. His message was simple yet powerful. Africa's future should be shaped by Africans, not dictated by foreign powers. Some leaders hesitated, concerned about the potential backlash from the West. But others, inspired by Ibrahim's courage, agreed that it was time for a new chapter in African history. Slowly, commitments began to arrive. Leaders from Mali, Guinea, and even distant Ethiopia expressed interest in attending a historic summit. For the first time in decades, there was serious discussion about African nations forging a new path, free from the economic chains of neocolonialism. Preparations for the summit were underway. Ouagadougou, once overlooked on the world stage, became the center of African political discourse. The streets were alive with anticipation. Hotels filled with delegations, flags from different African nations fluttered across government buildings, and banners proclaiming "Africa for Africans" adorned the city. For Ibrahim, this wasn't about grand speeches or superficial declarations. It was about laying the foundation for real, actionable change. When the day of the summit finally arrived, leaders from over 20 African countries gathered under one roof. The air was thick with emotion, a mixture of pride and the burden of responsibility. For too long, Africa's wealth had enriched foreign empires while its people suffered. Now, sitting together, these leaders had a chance to reverse centuries of exploitation. Ibrahim opened the summit with a powerful address. His voice, steady and unwavering, echoed through the grand hall. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we stand today not as separate nations but as one people bound by a shared history and a shared destiny. The world has treated us as resources to be extracted, markets to be exploited, and problems to be managed. But today, we say no more. Today, we declare that Africa's future will be written by African hands. The speech electrified the room. Delegates who had come with cautious optimism now felt a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next several days, the summit became a forum for real dialogue. Discussions ranged from forming joint economic zones to creating a unified African defense policy. Strategies to reduce dependency on foreign currencies were proposed, including the creation of a Pan-African currency to facilitate trade and strengthen economic independence. Perhaps the most significant outcome was the signing of a mutual cooperation pact, known as the Dakar Declaration, named after the planned follow-up summit in Senegal. This agreement committed participating nations to prioritize African-led development, reduce reliance on foreign aid, and collectively negotiate future trade deals with global powers to ensure fair terms. Though the summit ended with symbolic gesturous handshakes, group photos, and heartfelt declarations, it was the agreements forged behind closed doors that would have the most lasting impact. Ibrahim knew that change would not happen overnight. But for the first time, there was a united front. Africa had taken its first collective step toward economic liberation. As the summit concluded, the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with a new kind of optimism. Though the agreements signed were just the first steps in a long journey, the spirit of unity had never felt stronger. Across Africa, people began to imagine a continent where their leaders prioritized the interests of their people over the demands of foreign powers. The Dakar Declaration quickly became more than just a political document. It turned into a symbol of African resilience and self-determination. President Ibrahim Traoré returned to his office knowing the hardest part of his mission still lay ahead. Changing the mindset of a continent long subjected to foreign influence would take more than powerful speeches and symbolic gestures. It required building institutions that could support this new vision. His government wasted no time turning promises into action. Investment in domestic industries increased, with special economic zones created to boost local manufacturing and reduce reliance on imports. Young entrepreneurs were encouraged to lead the way in this economic revolution. Financial incentives were introduced for startups focused on agriculture, technology, and renewable energy. Schools introduced new curricula emphasizing African history, leadership, and innovation. It was no longer about teaching children to admire foreign powers, but inspiring them to believe in the greatness of their own continent. Meanwhile, the Western world watched these developments with growing concern. Economic sanctions were discussed behind closed doors, and pressure mounted on African leaders who had signed the Dakar Declaration. Some leaders wavered, struggling under the weight of financial restrictions and diplomatic isolation. But Ibrahim stood firm. He used every opportunity to remind his people that freedom was never won without sacrifice. In the face of these hardships, the people of Burkina Faso showed remarkable resilience. Communities came together to support each other. Farmers shared resources, families opened their homes to those in need, and local markets thrived despite the absence of foreign goods. The economy adjusted slowly, but the spirit of self-reliance grew stronger every day. 1 year after the summit, President Traoré addressed his nation once more. Standing before a massive crowd, he reminded them of how far they had come. "We have stood against storms and remained unshaken," he declared. "We have shown the world that Africa is not weak. We are not dependent. We are free people with proud hearts and unbreakable wills." These words resonated across the continent. Other African nations began implementing policies inspired by Burkina Faso's success. New alliances formed, independent trade agreements were signed, and the dream of a Pan-African economy started to take real shape. Though the challenges were far from over, It was clear. A new dawn had arrived for Africa. With the winds of change sweeping across Africa, it became clear that Ibrahim Traoré's bold stance had not only inspired millions but also drawn the full attention and ire of the Western world. Sanctions tightened, cutting off critical financial flows and freezing international assets. Foreign companies, pressured by their governments, withdrew investments, leaving projects unfinished and economies strained. The media in Europe and America painted Burkina Faso as a reckless nation on the brink of collapse, blaming Ibrahim for what they called economic mismanagement and political instability. But within the borders of Burkina Faso, a very different narrative unfolded. Despite the harsh economic climate, the people stood resilient. They understood that what they were enduring was the painful but necessary price of reclaiming their dignity. Ibrahim reminded his citizens that history had shown time and again no nation had ever achieved true freedom without sacrifice. His words weren't just rhetoric, he lived them. Cutting back on luxuries within his own administration, Ibrahim redirected funds to essential services, healthcare, education, and food security. The West attempted to sow division. Through covert channels and subtle propaganda, they supported opposition groups, hoping to fracture the unity of the Burkinabe people. But the movement Ibrahim had sparked had grown far beyond a single leader. It had become a grassroots revolution. Community leaders, youth organizations, and religious groups rallied together to maintain national solidarity. They organized food distribution centers, created job programs for the unemployed, and fostered a culture of shared responsibility. Yet, the hardships were undeniable. Inflation soared, and some families struggled to put food on the table. International trade routes were closed off, making it harder to acquire vital medicines and equipment. The burden weighed heavily on the most vulnerable. But even amidst their suffering, the people found strength in their collective resolve. They sang songs of freedom in the marketplaces, painted murals of their heroes on city walls, and held public forums discussing solutions to their common struggles. President Traoré knew that for this movement to survive, it had to transcend government policy and become a way of life. He toured the country relentlessly, visiting remote villages and bustling cities alike. Wherever he went, he listened carefully to the concerns of his people and offered reassurance that their suffering would not be in vain. His message was simple but powerful. We are writing our own story now, and every sacrifice you make brings us closer to a future where our children will never know the chains we once wore. The struggle caught the attention of the global South. Nations from Asia and Latin America, themselves familiar with the long fight against imperialism, expressed solidarity. Trade partnerships were quietly formed with sympathetic countries willing to bypass Western sanctions. Slowly, alternative markets began to open up, and the first signs of economic recovery emerged. Despite the suffering, hope endured, and with it, the belief that one day, the price of defiance would pay for a freedom more valuable than anything money could ever buy. Years passed, and the echoes of Burkina Faso's defiance continued to resonate across the African continent. What began as a single act of courage by President Ibrahim Traoré had blossomed into a full-fledged movement for sovereignty and unity. Though challenges persisted, the seeds of change had firmly taken root. The Pan-African economic initiatives conceived during the Dakar Declaration gradually materialized. Trade corridors opened between African nations, bypassing Western-controlled financial systems. A Pan-African digital currency pilot program was launched, and African startups began to flourish under new cooperative trade agreements. The long-held dream of economic independence was no longer just an idealistic vision, it was becoming a reality that everyday Africans could witness and benefit from. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership transcended politics. To his people, he became a symbol of unwavering integrity and resistance against oppression. His refusal to compromise, even in the darkest days of economic hardship, inspired not only his country, but also generations of young Africans who saw in him the living embodiment of their own hopes and struggles. As his presidency continued, he focused heavily on education and technological innovation. Believing that true freedom was rooted in knowledge, he oversaw the creation of advanced research centers, technology hubs, and scholarships aimed at empowering the next generation of African scientists, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. Though the road was difficult and progress often slow, the collective spirit of Burkina Faso remained unbreakable. The people walked taller, spoke with greater confidence, and saw themselves as the masters of their destiny. Across Africa, more leaders followed Ibrahim's example, breaking free from exploitative foreign agreements and forging their own path. In his later years, Ibrahim became a revered elder statesman. His speeches were no longer just calls to action, but reflections on a life dedicated to the service of his people. Standing before crowds that stretched beyond sight, he would remind them, "Freedom is not a gift, it is a fight, and every generation must be ready to take up that fight to preserve the dignity of our people." His passing, when it finally came, was mourned not just by the citizens of Burkina Faso, but by millions across Africa. Statues were erected in his honor, not to glorify a man, but to celebrate the ideals he had lived and died for. His legacy was not etched only in stone, but in the hearts and minds of those who continued his mission to ensure that Africa would forever stand free, proud, and united. So now, the question remains, will you be part of this story? History isn't just written by presidents and political leaders. It's shaped by ordinary people who choose to stand tall, to believe in their future, and to fight for dignity, no matter the cost. The legacy of President Ibrahim Traoré is not just a chapter in Burkina Faso's histories. It's a call to every one of us to rise above fear, to embrace unity, and to believe that a better future is possible when we stand together. If this story inspired you, take a moment right now to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? How do you think unity can shape the future of your community and your country? We'd love to hear your perspective. And remember, if you want to keep hearing stories like this, stories that challenge the status quo and remind us of the power of courage and hope, hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next inspiring chapter. Together, let's keep the spirit of freedom alive. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Stay proud, stay strong, and until next time, keep believing in a brighter tomorrow.